Our next visitor has perhaps the most well-known last name for ocean lovers around the world. Please join us for an interview with Philippe Cousteau as he brings us 76 years back to remember his grandfather, Jacques Cousteau, and all the way to today to talk about Philippe's current work.
Hello, everybody, and happy World Oceans Day. If you're just joining us, welcome to Coralpalooza Digital 2020. It's our first ever virtual Coralpalooza, and we are so beyond excited to be joined today by someone very special. He is a man with arguably the most famous last name in the underwater world, and somebody who is continuing an incredible legacy of underwater exploration, marine conservation, and education. We have with us today Philippe Cousteau. Philippe, thank you so much for being with us today.
Of course, Alice. Thrilled to be with you today. And of course, CRF is a terrific organization, so always happy to participate in anything y'all are doing.
Thank you. So let's launch into it. We're here to really talk about coral reefs and to talk about the incredible work you're doing with EarthEcho International. But I just know that a lot of people out there, there are a few important questions that we've got to get out of the way, first of all. So, you know, obviously you are a Cousteau. That name carries an awful lot of weight. The origin story for a Cousteau in marine conservation is obviously going to be very different from most people's stories of how they got involved. So could you just give us some insight into what it's like, you know, having this incredible name, what it was like being the grandson of the famous Jacques Cousteau, and yeah, just give us a little bit insight into what's it like to be you?
Well, I feel incredibly fortunate. It is an incredible legacy. You know, my grandfather, 76 years ago, co-invented scuba diving, or the aqualung, as he called it back then. He did so in partnership with an engineer named Émile Gagnon. And, I think it's easy for people to forget that prior to that time, the only way people could really explore the ocean was with, those old the copper hard helmets that you kind of see in old movies, or maybe in old books, Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea kind of thing, big heavy lead boots and a hose that would go up to the surface onto a boat with people that were like pumping air down to the diver. It was very dangerous, very difficult, reserved really for salvage divers, military, things like that. And other than that, it was free diving, holding your breath and swimming for a minute or two or three, however long you hold your breath for. And so it was an incredible innovation, a revolution, and it really opened up the oceans for people, because not only was my grandfather an inventor, he was also a filmmaker. And so along with his aqualung, he took cameras that he tinkered and made waterproof, because that didn't exist at the time, and took the cameras and thus the world with him on these adventures around the world through his documentaries and films that went on for decades. My father, Philippe Sr., joined him on those adventures, and he was someone who also filmed so many documentaries until he tragically died in an airplane accident in 1979, just a few months before I was born. Nevertheless, growing up with that legacy is inspiring. I know it's inspired people all over the world, and I'm no different. Growing up, hearing stories from my grandfather about his adventures and all the incredible things he did, and hearing stories about my father and all the wonderful things that he did is why I'm here today.
So was that drive always there, that passion for the underwater world? Was that just always there? Was that something you just grew up with?
It was, there was always curiosity, because, growing up with these stories, it was like real life Indiana Jones. These intrepid Frenchmen were going places no one had ever been before. They were exploring parts of the world that no one had ever seen before. For a kid growing up, that's some pretty heady stuff. It's pretty exciting. And to think that was part of my legacy and something I could pursue was really exciting. So I think the sense of adventure and the curiosity was something I always had. And then as I was exposed to diving and exposed to exploring the ocean, it was a passion that fostered at a pretty early age.
Cool. So what was your first experience of, obviously we're here to celebrate corals today. It is Coralpalooza after all. What was your first experience of a coral reef? Do you remember?
Yeah, my first experience of diving on a coral reef was actually in Jamaica. And it was when there was still some healthy coral there. There's a little bit left, but not much now. And it was just one of those memories I'll never forget, seeing the abundance and beauty on this dive of all the different colors and the majesty that exists. I truly think if there's a Garden of Eden on Earth, it is a healthy coral reef. And since then, I've had the privilege to dive all over the world and see coral reefs from the Red Sea, which I think is arguably the most spectacular reefs left in the world. Particularly a project I was able to do along the coast of Saudi Arabia, where because there's been essentially no tourism for decades, there's been very little coastal pressure on the coral reefs, and the coral reefs there are absolutely stunning. To of course the Great Barrier Reef, which is experiencing a lot of decline tragically, South Pacific, all over. So I've been very privileged to see coral reefs, and every single time I see one, it still takes my breath away.
That's amazing. I think a lot of us sort of feel the same way. What's been the biggest change then? Obviously, you've been diving. How old were you when you started diving?
Well, the first time I think I breathed through a regulator, I don't even remember. I was so little, but I got to go diving properly on a full dive, at depth, when I think my first one, I was 11. Now you have to remember, at the time, technically you weren't allowed to dive until you were 13, but I had some folks who were willing to bend the rules a little bit with me.
I think you get a pass. I
got a pass, and then I got certified at 13. But I'd been diving before that, kind of at the surface, or small little dives, typically in the south of France, where unfortunately there isn't really any coral left. But my first proper dive, I was 11 years old.
So, without revealing quite how old we are, that's quite a number of decades you've been diving. You must have seen, I know I've seen a lot of changes in the decades that I've been diving, as you must have as well. What for you has been the biggest change in the marine ecosystems that you've noticed over your lifetime?
Well, I know that just outside your door, Alice, is the Florida Keys, and I've spent a lot of time down there, and I think that having witnessed some of the changes there from the early 90s, the first time I ever dove in the Keys until now has been pretty dramatic. I've seen the decline in the Great Barrier Reef as well. Went diving there for the first time in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, and then was back there. Have been back several times, and was back there just about 2 years ago after a particularly egregious bleaching event, and was brought to tears underwater because the coral was everywhere was just white or covered in algae. That just a few years, 5 years earlier, had been beautiful and abundant. So I think that it's really the decline in the health of those ecosystems that I've seen in my lifetime. And interestingly enough, one of the challenges we face in conservation is this idea of shifting baselines. So my standard, in many ways, is when I was young, of what a healthy coral reef should look like. And yet, even in the 80s and 90s, the reefs were heavily degraded in the Florida Keys, for example, and even around the world. When I think about my grandfather's films in the south of France or in the Red Sea, in places in the Caribbean from the 60s and 70s, you look back at those places today and they're completely devastated. As I said, there's, you watch one of my grandfather's most famous early films, The Silent World, which was filmed a lot in the south of France, and there are grouper, and there are sharks, and there are reefs, and there's schools of fish, and it's spectacular. And you go to the same place now, and it's basically just algae and a few little fish pecking around. It's truly shocking. So the decline in ecosystems, I think, has been the greatest tragedy that I've seen. But on the flip side, visiting places like Cabo Pulmo in Mexico, which is famous as one of the most well-managed marine protected areas, marine parks in the world, established and managed by the local community. I've also seen a place where over 20 years, the biodiversity and the biomass, the amount of living stuff on the reef, has increased, 600-fold. So, when we implement the right conservation measures, I've also seen great success stories. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, to see how, when we get out of its way and, even give nature a little bit of a helping hand, how quickly it can bounce back, especially in the ocean. It is extraordinary. So talk to us a little bit about EarthEcho International. You know, why this focus on education? You know, what is this organization? What are you doing? I think it's a good segue because we're talking about, you know, let's make a difference. So tell us about this organization.
Well, you know, we and I know CRF does a lot in education too, so we're kindred spirits there as well. I think that one of the reasons we face the environmental challenges that we do is because we have neglected a youth strategy largely for the modern environmental movement for the last 50 years. You know, I work with a lot of the big conservation groups and they do a lot of terrific work, but predominantly, if you look at them and you look at their history for the last 20 or plus years, there's been very little, if any, investment in education. And I think that's a problem because fundamentally, in order to build a sustainable future that we all hope for and deserve, we need a cultural and social revolution, a shift in society to recognize that protection of the environment is not a political issue, that the idea that we have to sacrifice the environment to create jobs is nonsense. Like recognizing a few universal truths that we all have the right to clean air and clean water and a healthy environment is going to take that kind of a cultural shift. And the only way to build that kind of a cultural movement and build that momentum and grow the constituency, this is really important because environmental movement does a really good job of preaching to the converted. But in order to grow the constituency of people that care about these issues, we have to start with education. My grandfather always said this. He always said, you know, before we can talk about conservation, we have to talk about education. And so when I got out of university, I was looking around and thinking to myself, you know, what can my contribution be? And what I recognized is that there was very little of a youth strategy for the ocean, youth strategy for the environmental movement that existed. And so that's what we sought to build. And we founded EarthEcho 15 years ago. We've become one of the leading youth environmental education organizations in the world today. We have programs from India to Indianapolis and Brazil to Baltimore. I mean, we're all over the world. We seek to empower young people as the hearts and minds of the environmental movement, recognizing that they truly have the power to change the world if we give them agency, if we give them the knowledge and tools, not just telling them what to do, but give them the tools to come up with their own imagination. And we have youth leaders that have passed laws. We have youth leaders that have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars. We have youth leaders that have established protection for incredible vast areas, started new businesses in sustainability and composting. I mean, all sorts of different things. So it's really remarkable when you see and you give kids, young people, an opportunity. They truly can transform their communities and transform their countries. So I think that that's really what gives me hope. And we've seen tremendous impact of young people and the power they have to transform everything. And, you know, I would say, Alice, I think that the great news that exists out there amidst a sea of bad news is whenever I walk into a classroom, be it in Saudi Arabia, be it in France, be it in Brazil, be it in the United States, in Canada, in Mexico, you name it, kids are fired up about these issues. There is a level of enthusiasm and optimism and determination on the face of young people around the world that is really what gives me the hope to move forward in many cases. And that I think is really exciting because I never ever had an adult come up to me and say, you know, I didn't believe in climate change, but I saw a 30-second public service announcement, changed my mind. That doesn't happen. It's really hard to change adult behavior. But I've had so many adults come up to me and say, man, my kids came home from school or came home from camp or came home with this program or participated in this or whatever it is. And they wouldn't leave me alone about recycling, about changing this, about electric cars, about solar, about whatever it may be. And so we did it. It's the power of the nag. And so I really believe that young people, and the data shows that young people, when you invest in youth, you get a double return on that investment, because not only are you helping prepare them to be better citizens, their influence on adults is tremendous. In fact, lots of campaigns, smoking cessation, seatbelt campaigns, were successful when they recognized that if they started targeting young people to put pressure on their parents, they'd see change, and indeed they did. So it's really rooted, you know, our theory of change is really rooted in behavioral psychology and science. And is I think really exciting to see the change and the impact that we've fostered.
This is so awesome. It makes me think of that famous quote, "The child is the father of the man." What do you think is the best way to get kids excited about marine conservation and coral? Because, you know, coral, it's not a cute animal. The marine environment is a place that, you know, not very many people have an opportunity to experience firsthand. So in your experience, what's the best way to get kids excited and engaged with marine conservation and coral issues specifically?
Well, certainly, you know, the what coral has going for it is that it is the backbone of an ecosystem that is magnificent and so full of the creatures that kids do connect with. And so I think that's for us, that's very much, once you get young people to understand coral isn't a rock, but that it's an apartment building, you know, that it's this foundation of this city underwater that all these animals live in, and that is, you know, the most biodiverse ecosystem on Earth, even more so than rainforests. That, you know, that you can put some color, so to speak, into their story, works wonders. And of course, you know, today what we find is that what's different about the storytelling, really, you know, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a marine biologist. A lot of people assume I am because of my last name, but my grandfather was not. He never claimed to be. My father studied engineering and filmmaking. My uncle was an architect. He's an architect. So you know, none of us actually really have a science background. We're storytellers. And what we find is that story is really, really important, and meeting people where they are and providing opportunities. So, you know, when we look at the different ways to educate about coral, or about the ocean in general, we really have to be in lots of different places and leverage lots of different mediums. We've done virtual reality, we have books, we've done scripted television and online content. So scripted is like acting content. We've done unscripted, like documentaries. So we've done radio programs. We've done all sorts of different things for that meets different audiences and different demographics where they are. And but particularly for young people, I think it's really creating a story out of coral reefs, creating the characters out of coral reefs, and helping illuminate the wonder that exists in those places, and not being too pedantic and scientific at first, at least, because as we know, that can sometimes turn people off.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So if you could choose one change, if you could choose one thing, one change that people could make in their lives today, and of course, we know that there are many things to do to benefit the future of coral reefs, what would be your pick? What would be your one pick?
Well, I think, you know, appropriate as it's coming up to a very important date here in the United States in November for an election. What we always tell people is that a lot of the types of changes that we need to make in this country and in the world ultimately end up being legislative changes. And so what I would say is I want people to go out there and get involved politically, and not just historical groups like Democrats that support conservation of the environment. There's a growing movement amongst particularly young Republicans that recognize that protecting the environment is really important. And so make your voice heard. Go out there and advocate for these kinds of issues, no matter what political party you are, and make sure you vote in any elections, local, state, and federal, here in the United States or anywhere where anybody's watching in their country, to advocate for conservation at a political level, I think is really, really important. I'll share a quick story. 3 years ago, I was filming a documentary with my wife, Ashlyn, called Nuclear Sharks for Shark Week, for Discovery Shark Week. And we went out to the Marshall Islands, particularly to Bikini Atoll, where the United States had conducted nuclear bombing in the 1950s, nuclear testing. And we detonated the largest bomb ever in the history of the United States, Castle Bravo, which was 1,000 times stronger than the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We got to dive in the crater that was caused by that, because it still exists there in Bikini Atoll. The radiation has been dispersed by the ocean. The land, though, is still radioactive, so we can't really spend any time there. But in the ocean, it's dispersed. And while the crater itself was still devoid of any life, just a sandy kind of pit, just over the ridge, the coral was spectacular. And when you think that just 70 years ago, over 20 nuclear bombs were dropped in that area, devastating everything above and below the surface, killing everything. And in 70 years, because no people are there, it's become a de facto marine reserve. Life is flourishing. So restoration and renewal is possible if we give the ocean a chance. And that's also, I think, good news that people need to remember, is that restoration is critical. We can both be participants in the destruction of the ocean, and we can also be active participants in the renewal and restoration of the ocean. So yes, I'd love to come down, I will, and I've participated in these kinds of restoration, coral restoration programs. It's terrific work, it works. That's the great news. And it's exciting and it's fun and it's heartwarming to see the change over time that the positive change human beings can have. So a long-winded way of saying, of course.
Thank you, Philippe. We look forward to it so much. Okay, I think we're out of time. So for anybody watching, if you'd like to go out and go out there online and check out Philippe's amazing organization, that's EarthEcho International, correct? And that's earthechointernational.org.
Just earthecho.org, actually.
Sorry, earthecho.org. Yeah, go on there. You can find all the information about the incredible programs that Philippe and his team are running. Philippe, thank you so much. It's so lovely to chat with you, and I can't wait to have you down here diving with us in the Keys.
I know, when all this settles, we'll have a great time, get a dive in and maybe a couple beers like the old days, and restore some coral.
Yeah, man. Cool.
Sounds terrific.
Happy
Thanks
World
for having me
Oceans Day, dude.
Happy World Oceans Day.
Bye.
Bye.